Story 1. The Uninvited Guest. It was the summer before everything would change. I was 18, on the cusp of leaving behind my small town and everything familiar to start college in a different city. The days were long and hot, the kind of summer days that seemed to stretch out endlessly, but there was an undercurrent of something excitement mixed with a touch of dread, a sense that this was the last of something precious. My friend Miranda decided to throw a pool party at her house to celebrate our graduation and the impending start of college life. Her house was the perfect spot for such an event. It was a large 2-story home with a sprawling backyard and a pool that seemed to beckon you on those sweltering days. Her parents were out of town, as they often were, leaving the house free for us to do as we pleased. This wasn't unusual. Miranda's place had become the go-to spot for all our gatherings over the years, and this night was meant to be the biggest and best of them all. The party started in the late afternoon, with people arriving in groups, carrying coolers filled with drinks and bags of snacks. The music was loud, the kind of music that thumped in your chest and made it impossible not to feel the energy of the night. As the sun began to set, the backyard filled with people some we knew well, and others who were just friends of friends. By the time the stars were out, there were over 150 people packed into the space, and the party had taken on a life of its own. I arrived early with my friend Jonah. We were close to Miranda and wanted to help her set up, but by the time we finished, the party was already well underway. People were everywhere in the pool, on the lawn, sitting on the deck. The air was thick with laughter, the scent of chlorine, and the faint smell of alcohol. It felt like one of those perfect summer nights, the kind you wish you could bottle up and keep forever. I remember the look on her face as she scanned the crowd, anxiety mixed with frustration. She had wanted this to be a fun night, a last hurrah, but it was quickly becoming overwhelming. Around midnight, things took a turn. A group of people we didn't know crashed the party, and Miranda, clearly fed up, tried to ask them to leave. They just laughed her off, and the tension in the air thickened. It was around this time that I started noticing other strange things, people whispering in corners, furtive glances exchanged, and an overall sense that not everyone was here just to have a good time. By a.m., the police had arrived, responding to multiple noise complaints from the neighbors. The music was cut, and they began herding people out. The crowd thinned quickly, and within half an hour, the house was nearly empty. Only a small group of us remained: Miranda, a few of her close girlfriends, Jonah, myself, and Steve, who had passed out drunk on one of the beds upstairs. We were all a bit on edge after the night's events, but mostly just tired. We decided to clean up before crashing for the night. The house was a mess. Empty cans and bottles littered the lawn. Discarded cups floated in the pool, and inside, it looked like a tornado had passed through. We worked silently, the earlier excitement now replaced by exhaustion and a lingering sense of unease. It was nearly a.m. by the time we finished. We gathered in the living room, the air conditioning a welcome relief from the humidity outside. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos just hours before. Miranda and one of her friends decided to head upstairs to her room. Jonah stretched out on the couch, and I made my way to her parents' bedroom. I wasn't in any condition to drive home, and besides, the idea of leaving alone in the dark felt unappealing. I don't know how long I had been lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a loud crack like wood splintering under pressure. It was a sharp, distinct sound that cut through the stillness of the house. I sat up, my heart suddenly racing. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just the house settling or maybe something falling over. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The sound came again, this time followed by what sounded like footsteps. I froze, straining to hear more. Then From somewhere down the hall, I heard a soft, almost inaudible whisper, like someone talking just out of earshot. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was someone still in the house? One of the party crashers who had refused to leave. I got up slowly, careful not to make a sound. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, peering out into the darkened hallway. The house was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of a street lamp outside, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I made my way down the hall towards Miranda's room. I could hear her and her friend talking softly inside, their voices tinged with fear. When I reached the door, I knocked gently, not wanting to startle them. There was a pause, and then Miranda's voice, shaky and uncertain, called out, "Who is it?" "It's me," I whispered back. "Did you hear that?" The door creaked open, and Miranda's pale face appeared in the crack. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think someone's in the house." The words sent a chill down my spine. I stepped into the room, and Miranda closed the door behind me, locking it with a shaky hand. Her friend was sitting on the bed, clutching a pillow to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. "We should check it out," I said, though my voice betrayed the fact that I was just as scared as they were. Miranda shook her head vehemently. "No, we should stay here together. If someone's in the house, we don't want to be wandering around alone." She was right, of course. But the thought of just sitting here, waiting for something to happen, was unbearable. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning for anything that could be used as a weapon. There was nothing, just the usual bedroom furniture and a few decorative items. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think of what to do next. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from somewhere downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. We all jumped, Miranda letting out a small gasp of fear. We were frozen in place, staring at each other in terror, when we heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone taking their time, savoring each step. The sound echoed through the silent house, growing louder and louder as whoever it was approached the second floor. "We have to hide," I whispered urgently. "Now." We scrambled to find a place to hide. Miranda and her friend dove under the bed, pulling the comforter down to cover them. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. There was nowhere to go, no closet, no large piece of furniture to hide behind. My eyes landed on the window, and without thinking, I rushed over and opened it as quietly as I could. The drop to the ground wasn't too far, but it was far enough that jumping was risky. But I didn't have a choice. The footsteps were almost at the top of the stairs now, and I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of whoever was coming. I swung one leg over the windowsill, then the other, and lowered myself down as far as I could before letting go. I landed hard on the ground below, the impact sending a sharp pain up my leg. But I didn't stop to assess the damage. I scrambled to my feet and bolted around the side of the house, heading for the front yard. My heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had to get to the others, Jonah and Steve, and get out of there. As I rounded the corner of the house, I spotted Jonah standing on the porch, looking confused and half asleep. "Jonah," I hissed, waving frantically for him to follow me. "We have to go now." Jonah blinked at me, clearly not understanding the urgency of the situation. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice groggy. "There's someone in the house," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him towards the driveway. "We need to get out of here." I half dragged Jonah to the car, my eyes darting nervously back towards the house. I could see the dim outline of someone standing in the window of Miranda's room, watching us. A shiver ran down my spine, and I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip them. Just as I managed to unlock the car, I heard a blood-curdling scream from inside the house. Miranda's scream. My heart lurched in my chest, and I froze, torn between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming need to help my friends. Jonah, now fully awake, grabbed my arm. "We have to go back," he said urgently. "We can't just leave them in there." I nodded, though every fiber of my being was screaming to just get in the car and drive away. But Jonah was right. We couldn't leave them behind. We ran back towards the house, bursting through the front door just as another scream echoed from upstairs. We charged up the stairs, adrenaline propelling us forward. When we reached Miranda's room, the door was wide open, and the room was empty. The window was still open, the curtains billowing in the breeze, but there was no sign of Miranda or her friend. "Where are they?" Jonah whispered, his voice filled with panic. I had no answer. The room was in disarray, the bed sheets tangled and the furniture knocked askew. It was as if they had been dragged out of the room, but there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no clues as to what had happened. Suddenly, we heard footsteps again, this time coming from the hallway behind us. We turned slowly, our hearts in our throats, and saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a tall man dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by shadows. He was holding something, a long, glinting object that caught the faint light from the window. Jonah grabbed my arm, pulling me back into the room. "We have to go now," he hissed, but I was frozen in place. My eyes locked on the figure in the hallway. The man took a step towards us, and then another. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear that radiated from us. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. Who was this man? What had he done with Miranda and her friend? Finally, Jonah's voice snapped me out of my paralysis. "Come on," he shouted, yanking me towards the window. We didn't have time to hesitate. We climbed out the window, dropping to the ground below. The pain in my leg flared up again as I landed, but I ignored it, pulling Jonah towards the car. We had to get out of there, whatever had happened to Miranda and her friend. We were powerless to stop it now. As we sped away from the house, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Miranda and her friend were gone, disappeared without a trace. The man in the hallway, the one with the glinting object, was still out there, and we had no idea who he was or what he wanted. The police were called, of course. They searched the house, the surrounding area, but they found nothing. No sign of Miranda, no sign of her friend, and no sign of the man. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. People whispered about what had happened at the party, about the strange man who had appeared out of nowhere. Some said he was a ghost. Others claimed he was a serial killer who had been stalking our town for years. But no one knew the truth, and the mystery only deepened as time went on. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the man was still out there, watching, waiting, and that one day he would come back for the rest of us. Story 2. The Man by the Creek. There's something about the solitude of nature that I've always found deeply comforting. The quiet stillness, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the steady flow of water in a creek, it all comes together to create a sanctuary far removed from the chaos of everyday life. For as long as I can remember, I've sought out these quiet places where I could escape from the noise and just be with my thoughts. One such place was a creek about an hour's drive from my house. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a small, winding stream of water that cut through the woods and eventually fed into a larger river. But it was secluded, and that was what mattered to me. On the weekends, I'd load up my kayak, drive out to the gravel parking area near the creek, and spend the day paddling along its gentle currents, enjoying the peace and quiet. This particular Saturday was one of those days. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, with just enough of a breeze to keep things comfortable. I had woken up early, eager to get out on the water before the day grew too hot. By the time I arrived at the creek, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I was the first one there, as usual, and I relished the thought of having the entire creek to myself. I parked my car in the small, gravelly lot that served as the unofficial entrance to the creek. It was a simple, unmarked spot, just a clearing in the trees where the ground had been worn down by years of cars pulling in and out. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate that this place was even here unless you knew where to look. I unloaded my kayak from the roof of my car, the familiar routine helping to ease me into the day. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of morning that promises a perfect day ahead. I carried the kayak down to the water's edge, the path worn smooth by my frequent visits. As I set the kayak into the water and climbed in, I felt the usual sense of calm wash over me. This was my happy place, my escape. For the first hour, everything was as it always was. I paddled lazily down the creek, the water barely rippling around me. The trees on either side formed a natural canopy overhead, their leaves filtering the sunlight into dappled patches of warmth. Birds chirped from somewhere high above, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of a fish darting through the clear water beneath me. It was perfect, just me, the water, and the soothing embrace of nature. I was about 20 minutes into my journey when I noticed something unusual. Up ahead, where the creek curved gently to the left, I spotted a figure standing at the water's edge. My heart skipped a beat. This was the first time I had ever seen anyone else out here. The creek was so remote, so out of the way, that I had always assumed it was my own little secret. The figure was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed out of place on such a bright, sunny day. He was standing still, his hands on his hips, staring out at the water as if lost in thought. As I drew closer, he turned his head and noticed me. A wide smile spread across his face, but there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'm not sure why, but my first instinct was to keep paddling, to pass by him without stopping. But as I got closer, the man raised a hand and waved, as if expecting me to stop and chat. It would have been rude to ignore him, and so, despite my unease, I slowed my paddling and brought the kayak to a gentle stop near the bank. "Good morning," I called out, forcing a smile of my own. My voice sounded thin and uncertain, even to my own ears. "Morning," the man replied, still smiling. He took a step closer to the water, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, though I could feel my heart beginning to race. There was something unsettling about the way he was looking at me, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Are you out here often?" The man shrugged, still smiling that same unsettling smile. "Every now and then," he said vaguely. "Just enjoying the peace and quiet like you." I nodded, my grip on the paddle tightening. The conversation felt stilted, unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this whole situation, something that made me want to put as much distance between myself and this man as possible. "Well, I'd better keep moving," I said, trying to sound casual. "Got a lot of creek to explore today." The man nodded, but his smile never wavered. "Of course," he said. "Enjoy your paddle." I dipped my paddle back into the water and started to move away, my heart still racing. As I passed by him, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. The man was still standing there, watching me with that same unnerving smile. I paddled faster, eager to put as much distance between us as possible. For the next few minutes, I forced myself to focus on the water, the trees, anything but the encounter I just had. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Something about that man, about the way he had smiled at me, had left me deeply unsettled. I was about half a mile down the creek when I heard the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I froze, my paddle hovering above the water. The sound was coming from the bank to my left, where the trees grew thick and the undergrowth was dense. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods and the gentle sound of the creek. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. The man from earlier, partially hidden behind a tree, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of panic rise up in my chest. He had followed me. There was no mistaking it. He had left the spot where I'd first seen him and was now stalking me from the shadows. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was he following me? What did he want? I forced myself to keep paddling, though my hands were trembling. I couldn't let him know I'd seen him. I needed to stay calm, stay in control. Maybe he was just curious, I told myself, though I knew deep down that wasn't true. No one follows someone through the woods out of mere curiosity. I glanced back again, and this time I saw him more clearly. He was still keeping to the shadows, moving silently through the trees, but his eyes were locked on me, unblinking. The smile was gone now, replaced by a look of cold, calculating intent. It was as if he was studying me, waiting for the right moment to make his move. A wave of cold fear washed over me. I needed to get out of here. The creek was remote, isolated. If anything happened to me out here, no one would know. My phone was back in the car, useless in this situation. There was no one to call for help, no one to hear me if I screamed. I paddled faster, my strokes growing frantic as I tried to put as much distance between us as possible. But the creek was winding, and no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, just out of sight, watching me. Finally, I reached a wider stretch of the creek, where the trees thinned out and the sunlight poured down in warm, golden rays. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that I had lost him, that he had given up the chase. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time much closer. I whipped my head around, and there he was, standing at the water's edge, barely 10 feet away. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was standing in plain sight, his eyes locked on mine. The look on his face sent a chill down my spine. It was the look of a predator who had found his prey. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a surge of panic. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and let him come for me. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The creek was too narrow to turn the kayak around quickly, and he was too close for me to try and make a run for it. I tightened my grip on the paddle, my knuckles white. If he came any closer, I'd have to defend myself. But the thought of fighting him, of what might happen if I lost, filled me with dread. I could see the tension in his posture, the way he was coiled like a spring, ready to pounce. Then, without warning, he lunged. I reacted on pure instinct, swinging the paddle as hard as I could. It connected with his arm, the force of the blow sending him stumbling back. He let out a grunt of pain, but it didn't stop him. He regained his balance and lunged again, this time grabbing onto the side of the kayak. I screamed, thrashing with the paddle as I tried to push him away, but he was too strong. His grip was iron, his eyes wild with a terrifying intensity. He was pulling the kayak towards the shore, his strength overwhelming my frantic attempts to escape. I knew I was running out of time. If he got me onto the shore, I'd have no chance. Desperation gave me strength, and I swung the paddle again, this time aiming for his head. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man let out a cry of pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to push him back. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I paddled as hard as I could, my muscles burning with the effort. The kayak shot forward, away from the shore, away from the man who had tried to drag me into the woods. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The creek was winding, and every turn felt like it might bring me face to face with him again. But after what felt like an eternity, I reached the spot where I had started, the gravelly bank where my car was parked. I didn't even bother pulling the kayak all the way out of the water. I just jumped out and ran. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep moving. I could see my car up ahead, the sight of it a beacon of safety in the otherwise desolate landscape. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped them twice, before finally managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling fingers. For a moment, I just sat there, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what had just happened. But then, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. He was standing at the edge of the parking area, watching me with that same cold, calculating stare. I could see the anger in his eyes, the frustration of having lost his prey. But he didn't move, he just stood there, his chest heaving with the effort of catching his breath. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the parking area, gravel spraying up behind me. As I sped down the narrow dirt road that led back to the main highway, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing after me, but he didn't follow. He just stood there, watching, until I was out of sight. It wasn't until I was back on the highway, surrounded by other cars, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still shaking, my heart still racing, but I was safe. I had escaped, or so I thought. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, that he was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Every time I left my house, I found myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the crowds for his familiar face. But I never saw him again. Still, the memory of that day haunts me. The look in his eyes, the cold, calculating way he had stalked me through the woods, it was something I would never forget. And though I never returned to that creek, the fear stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I had come to something truly terrifying. Story 3. The Whispering in the Woods. There's something profoundly unsettling about being alone in the wilderness. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seem to close in around you, it can make even the bravest among us feel vulnerable. But for my friends and me, camping in remote locations had always been a tradition, a way to escape the pressures of everyday life and reconnect with nature. It was the summer after our sophomore year of college, and we had decided to take our annual camping trip to a new location, West Glacier, Montana. The area was known for its rugged beauty, towering mountains, dense forests, and clear, cold rivers that cut through the wilderness like veins of glass. We were excited to spend a few days away from everything, just the three of us, Luke, Matt, and myself, exploring the trails, fishing in the river, and enjoying the peace and quiet that only the wilderness could offer. Luke, an avid photographer, was particularly eager for this trip. He had brought along his camera equipment, determined to capture the stunning scenery. The first day was everything we had hoped for. We hiked for miles, taking in the breathtaking views and enjoying the solitude. Luke spent most of the day snapping photos, often falling behind as he searched for the perfect shot. By the time we made camp that evening, we were exhausted but content. We pitched our tents near the edge of a small clearing, not far from a river that provided a constant, soothing soundtrack to the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, we built a fire and settled in for the evening. We cooked dinner over the flames, the smell of roasting meat mingling with the fresh scent of pine. The stars began to emerge, one by one, until the sky was a canvas of glittering points of light. It was peaceful, just the three of us, the fire, and the vast, silent wilderness stretching out in every direction. The first night passed without incident. We talked, laughed, and eventually retired to our tents, the exhaustion of the day's hike quickly lulling us to sleep. I had my own tent, while Luke and Matt shared theirs. The night was cool, and I fell asleep almost immediately, the sounds of the river and the occasional rustle of leaves the only things disturbing the silence. The next day, we spent the morning fishing at the river. The fish were biting, and by noon we had caught more than enough for a hearty lunch. We returned to camp, cooked up our catch, and spent the afternoon lounging by the water, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the crisp, clean air. It was the kind of day that made all the effort of the hike worth it, simple, quiet, and satisfying. But as the sun began to set, something changed. The atmosphere, once serene, seemed to shift subtly. The air grew cooler, the shadows deeper, and a sense of unease settled over our camp. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We tried to shake it off, attributing it to our imaginations. After all, we were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife. There was nothing out here to be afraid of. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the daylight faded and the darkness closed in around us. After dinner, we sat around the fire, the conversation more subdued than the night before. Luke had his camera out, flipping through the photos he'd taken over the past 2 days. Every now and then, he'd show us a shot, and we'd admire the way he'd captured the light filtering through the trees, or the way the river sparkled in the afternoon sun. But as the night wore on, the unease grew harder to ignore. The forest, which had felt so welcoming during the day, now seemed to press in on us, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The fire, once a source of warmth and comfort, now cast flickering shadows that danced eerily across the ground. It was Matt who first voiced what we were all feeling. "Does it feel different to you guys tonight?" he asked, his voice low, as if he didn't want to disturb the stillness. Luke looked up from his camera, frowning slightly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I don't know what it is, but something feels off." I nodded in agreement. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that hadn't been there the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. We tried to brush it off, but the feeling persisted. Finally, after what felt like hours, we decided to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and the darkness felt oppressive, as if it were pressing in on us from all sides. We extinguished the fire, the last embers glowing faintly in the night, and retreated to our tents. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual noises, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rush of the river were all there, but they seemed muted, as if the forest were holding its breath. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing out there but the usual wildlife. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. Just as I was beginning to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, coming from somewhere in the woods. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that it was just the wind or the rustle of leaves. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Hello," the voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was something about it that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't sound right. There was an unnatural quality to it, as if it were coming from someone who didn't quite know how to mimic human speech. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you guys hear that?" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard rustling from the tent next to mine. "Yeah," Matt's voice came, shaky and uncertain. "What was that?" "I don't know," I replied, my eyes scanning the darkness outside my tent. "It sounded like someone's out there." Another voice, Luke's this time, joined in. "No way. We're miles from the nearest town. Who would be out here?" But even as he said it, I could hear the fear in his voice. We all knew there was no one else out here. No other campers, no hikers. Nothing but the three of us and the vast empty wilderness. The idea that someone or something was out there, calling to us in the middle of the night, was terrifying. For a long moment, we sat in silence, listening. The voice came again, closer this time. "Hello," it repeated, the word drawn out, as if the speaker were savoring the sound. It was then that I realized something else, something that made my blood run cold. The voice didn't sound like a woman's anymore. It was deeper, rougher, as if it were a man trying to mimic a woman's voice. There was a strange, almost mocking tone to it, as if the speaker were playing some sort of twisted game. "Hello," the voice was closer now, almost right outside the tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sound of someone or something moving through the underbrush. My heart was racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. People didn't just wander through the woods in the middle of the night, calling out like this. But the sounds were real enough, the voice unmistakable. And then, suddenly, the voice changed. The soft, almost sing-song tone was replaced by something much more menacing. The words were the same, but the way they were spoken sent a jolt of fear through me. Double quotes, hello question, mark double quotes. It was a command now, not a question. A demand that we answer, that we acknowledge the presence outside our tents. I heard Matt gasp from his tent, and Luke muttering something under his breath, too low for me to hear. I wanted to call out, to tell them we should stay quiet, but I couldn't find my voice. I was frozen in place, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside my tent. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot, the sound of breathing low, steady, inhuman. The voice spoke again, so close now that I could almost feel the breath against the fabric of my tent. "Hello," the word hung in the air, thick with malice. It wasn't a greeting, it was a threat. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The footsteps, the voice, the breathing, everything went silent. The only sound was the blood rushing in my ears, my own ragged breathing as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. For a long moment, I didn't move. I didn't dare. I just sat there, staring at the darkness, waiting for the voice to return. But it didn't. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until finally I allowed myself to breathe again. "Is it gone?" Matt's voice broke the silence, shaky and terrified. I think so," I replied, though I wasn't sure. The silence felt wrong, unnatural, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "We should get out of here," Luke said, his voice low and urgent. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and go." There was no argument from any of us. The idea of spending another night in this place was unbearable. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't something we wanted to encounter again. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. None of us slept much, and when the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we were already packing up our camp. The forest, which had seemed so menacing in the dark, now appeared almost normal in the daylight. But the memory of the voice, of the footsteps, lingered in the back of our minds, a reminder that the wilderness held secrets we couldn't begin to understand. As we hiked back to the trailhead, the unease that had settled over us the night before refused to lift. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our thoughts, replaying the events of the night in our minds. It wasn't until we reached the car that any of us spoke again. "Do you think it was just someone messing with us?" Matt asked as we loaded our gear into the trunk. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "It didn't feel like that." Luke shook his head, his expression grim. "Whatever it was, I don't ever want to experience it again." We piled into the car, eager to put as much distance between ourselves and the forest as possible. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us, even now. It wasn't until we were hours away, the dense forest giving way to open fields and small towns, that I finally began to relax. The memory of the voice, the footsteps, still haunted me, but I told myself it was over. We were safe. But later that night, as we settled into a cheap motel room for the night, something happened that made me question everything. Luke was going through his camera, reviewing the photos he had taken on our trip. He was scrolling through them quickly, not really paying attention, when he suddenly froze. "Guys," he said, his voice tight with fear, "you need to see this." Matt and I crowded around, staring at the small screen of the camera. Luke flipped back a few photos, and my heart skipped a beat. There, in one of the photos, was our campsite. The tents, the fire pit, everything was there, just as it had been. But there was something else in the photo, something that hadn't been there when the picture was taken. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking it. It was the source of the voice, the one that had haunted us in the woods. The photo sent a chill down my spine. We had been watched all along. Whoever or whatever it was, it had been out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. We never spoke of that night again. The memory was too unsettling, too terrifying to revisit. But the photo remained, a grim reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows, the things that watch and wait just beyond the light. And every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that voice, whispering from the darkness, calling out to me, "Hello." Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.